Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session. We are focusing on equitable services for our non-public schools. So we are joined by the ESEA team. You folks may be aware of who the individuals are, but we just want to highlight everyone and the role and responsibility. The way our staff is structured is every SAU has a regional program manager, and our regional program managers also serve as title specialists. So you'll see their name and their affiliation right on the screen. And really, as a team, we work to be sure that the oversight of all federal funds within our ESEA programs are carried out. We also want to be sure that we're ensuring that schools provide all children with significant opportunity to receive fair, equitable, and high quality education. At this time, what we are asking for are, can you folks still see my screen?
Yes.
I see some nods. Thank you for the confirmation. I just wanted to be sure. At this time, what we are asking is that you take a moment in the chat box to introduce yourself. We'd love to know your name and your affiliation. And this will be able to create a network of individuals in conversation as we work through today's agenda and topics. So just a few housekeeping items as we move into our presentation for today. We will work to be sure that we're responding to questions that are in the chat box. So if you can use that feature, that would be greatly appreciated. We as a team are also monitoring the chat. We will also provide an opportunity at the end of the material to open it up to participants to pose additional questions. We do ask that you mute yourself if you are not asking questions or engaging in conversation to keep the distractions to a minimum. The slides will be available within the next week on our website. Our website has been restructured a tiny bit, so just calling your attention to the ESEA guidance section on our website. We'll have these materials. Our goal for today is really to identify and gain a better understanding of equitable services under ESEA title programs, to determine what best practices and ongoing meaningful consultation is and how that's defined in statute, understanding the process of requesting and providing equitable services, but also really being familiar with the statutory requirements that govern equitable services.
All right, Shelley, I assume that's my cue, though I'll be honest right now. Oh, there it goes. Now the slides are changing. For some reason, I couldn't see them. So we're going to start today with a brief overview of what equitable services are and some of the basic requirements to receive those services. So equitable services is the process of providing students, teachers, staff, and families at eligible non-public, or what we often call private schools, with equitable access to federally funded education programs and services. And using the phrase equitable services here is very intentional, as the funding behind these services is always in control of the public SAU. So no federal funding, at least for ESEA purposes, ever goes from the public SAU to the non-public school. It's always about providing equitable services. And this is something you're going to hear us repeat quite a few times today. So in terms of the general requirements for how to receive equitable services, like I just mentioned, the funding remains directly with the public SAU. Those services may differ a little bit from what the public SAU does with their students, so long as the services being provided meet the needs of the students at the non-public school. So for example, if in your public SAU, they're using their Title I funds for reading intervention services because that's what their students need, and at your non-public SAU, the highest area of need is math, you may be able to use Title I to provide math interventions. So it's not the same exactly, but it's based on the needs of the students in that school. All the equitable services provided have to be secular and non-ideological. And while most of us are probably pretty familiar with the secular aspects of federal funding, we do see some folks getting tripped up on the ideological side. So as an example, if you were looking to do professional development and you were a Montessori school and you were looking to send staff to a purely Montessori training, that may cross that line from being based on the needs of the students to being ideological and based on the needs of the school and not allowed for equitable services. And lastly, as with anything the federal government provides us with, we need to make sure we're maintaining documentation, either written or digitally, of everything we do in case of any audits or monitoring. So, what are some of your requirements to receive equitable services? Well, first and foremost, as a non-public school, you have to be state approved, nonprofit, located within the state of Maine, and serving students from grades kindergarten through grade 12. So if you are serving postgraduate students, if you are a for-profit institution, if you are not approved by the Maine Department of Education, if you're not located in the state of Maine, then you would not be eligible to receive equitable services in the state of Maine. You're also required to submit some data to us, and we'll talk about this a couple times today. For Title I, you're submitting your low-income student data in the fall of every year. And for Titles 2 and 4, we have to have you confirm what your October 1 enrollments are. Because when we look at equitable services, they are proportional between your student population and the population of students in the public SAU in which you reside. So we need that data to determine how much services your students are entitled to. Then in working with the public SAU, there's a number of required forms, applications, performance reports, monitoring requirements that may need to be done in order for you to remain eligible for equitable services. And if your students are receiving Title I or Title III, those students have to be identified through a formal process in order to receive services. Keep in mind the choice for whether a non-public school wishes to participate in equitable services under ESEA rests with the leadership of that non-public school. The public SAU can't deny them equitable services on their own. And this is a decision that can be revisited each school year. So how do you go about obtaining those equitable services? Well, like I just mentioned, you're going to complete some surveys. So for Title I, if that's the sort of equitable services your school is looking for, every fall, you're using our data platform to submit that low-income student data. Every summer, we provide training on how to do that. If you're looking at Titles 2 and 4 for equitable services, you're either confirming or providing us with your October 1 counts in a survey each spring, and we'll have the link to that survey for you at the very end of the slideshow. And if we're talking about Title 3, you have to have multilingual students that are identified using the statewide identification procedures. You have to have an established ESOL program with a certified ESOL teacher, because like with all funds, these need to be supplemental, right? These need to be extra services beyond what's already required. When that's done, you're going to conduct a school needs assessment because you need to determine what those high areas of student need in your school are. And this is something you can do as part of consulting with your public SAU and on an ongoing basis. When you're doing that needs assessment, there are a variety of stakeholders you have to involve. And again, your public SAU is a great resource to help you with this. But oftentimes we're talking about your administrators, your teachers, your parents, and students all having a say in determining what your areas of high need are. You need to complete and sign a participation form, which we're going to show you here in a little bit. And you're working with the SAU because they submit a formal ESEA application to us every year. And in that application, there will be a project for your non-public school that has a narrative on what funds are being spent on, a budget for what function and object codes are going to need to be built against, and some SMART goals so we can measure any progress for this ESEA funded work. Once all of that's complete and your district, your public SAU has an approved ESEA application, you're then going to actually receive those equitable services. And those can be provided directly by your partner SAU, another public SAU, or through an agreement with a private company. So we'll use Title I as an example here. If your students are receiving Title I equitable services at your non-public school, the person providing that Title I intervention could be a public school employee who's coming to your non-public to provide those services. It could be that your students travel to the public SAU to receive services from a public SAU's employee. Or they could hire an individual, a private contractor, to provide those services, again, at your school or at another site. All these services, of course, are for the benefit of the students enrolled in that non-public school and not the school itself. And I know that part can be a little bit tricky, but hopefully we'll have some examples for you later on that help differentiate that.
I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and reshare just because I have heard that some folks are not seeing my screen. So I'm just going to give it one more try just to do our very best to be sure that the material is available for all. Can I have a confirmation that some folks are seeing my slides? Yep. Thumbs up. Thank you so very much.
All right. Can folks hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up, Shelley? Perfect. So one of the most important aspects of equitable services under ESEA is the consultation process that takes place between public school administrative units and their non-public school partners. So consultation is the process that occurs as part of an ongoing collaboration where key leaders from both organizations meet to discuss the needs of their respective students and how the needs of those students can be met through ESEA federal funding. Now, the overall goal of this work is to identify, plan, and ultimately carry out programs and services that will serve to meet those identified needs of students who attend both the public and non-public schools. Now, the consultation process does include discussion of many important topics and should also include candid conversation around the needs of students, again, both in the non-public school and the public schools, but really basically talking about those high areas of need that have resulted from each organization's respective needs assessment process. Now, following those identifications of high areas of need, there must be conversation around the various allowable uses of ESEA funds and really how equitable services can best be delivered to meet the needs of the students that are enrolled in the non-public school. So once student needs have been identified and proposed equitable services have been determined, there should be subsequent conversation around what sort of performance measures or goals will be established for the resulting work. So that those equitable services can, over time, be monitored and evaluated for effectiveness. As mentioned earlier, consultation around equitable services should be an ongoing process, i.e., it's not meant to be something that only happens once a year at the time of applying for ESEA funds. Rather, it's best practice to hold regular check-in meetings where staff from the public school administrative unit and non-public school regularly meet and collaborate with one another to ensure that the programs and activities being funded through ESEA funds are on track and are having the desired impact on student outcomes. Now, again, as part of the overall consultation process, we do recommend establishing protocols for collecting, sharing, and reporting out of program data throughout the year. It's really imperative that this takes place early on so that there's kind of a set and established parameters around what data will be collected, what will be shared, and when. Largely establishing these sorts of protocols ahead of time will make things much easier for both parties when it comes time to report out on those programs and activities that have been funded through ESEA funding. Now, I will add the department's website does have some useful resources, particularly if you might be new to your role or maybe you have a new non-public school that's recently began operations within your school district. We highly recommend that folks take a look at our resources page. We have a resource guide specifically on the consultation process. I'm hoping one of my colleagues here can link that in chat for folks. But again, very great resource and something that would be helpful for folks as they go through the consultation process each year. Now, in terms of timing for consultation, throughout the entirety of the consultation process, there are going to be some important milestones that folks should be aware of. For those non-public schools specifically that wish to participate in the Title I Part A program, the first of these milestones begin in July and August, where non-public school officials should partake in some required department training around reporting out on low-income student data for the students enrolled in their school. After having gone through that training, kind of the other side to that coin happens in September when the state collects student information from both public and non-public schools. So this is a point in time of the year where a non-public school staff member or official would be responsible for entering, verifying, and submitting their low-income student data within the department's state student information system. Now, as a point of clarification, these pieces to the timeline, again, are specific to the Title I program, but they also are essentially take place in the year directly preceding when the non-public school would wish to participate in the Title I program. So let's say, for example, we're talking about the upcoming ESEA application for this year. These July and September dates would have been for last year. Because essentially we collect and refer to data from the directly preceding reporting year. So those figures are due to the department annually on October 1st. So just keep in mind that if you want to say participate in the Title I program next year, you'll want to make sure you have that data in by October 1st of this year. Moving forward in the timeline, again, as it relates to all other ESEA programs outside of Title I, the process really begins in March of the current year, where non-public school officials complete and submit to the department an enrollment verification survey. Essentially, this is just a survey that's a report out of total enrollment for your non-public school. And we use that data to determine the level of equitable services that the non-public school will be eligible for under the other non-Title I ESEA programs. So moving along into April and May, and I guess continuing into June and July, this is more so when that formal consultation process between your public school district and non-public school should be occurring. It's important at this point in time where we're kind of talking about what student needs are, what services we intend to provide, and really further begin to develop what the actual project language, budget information, and related goals specific to that work look like, and begin to incorporate that information into the public SAU's ESEA application for that given fiscal year. July is also kind of the point in time in the year where your public SAUs will be relying a bit more on their non-public school partners to complete, sign, and submit what we call our Equitable Services Participation Form. This is an external document that folks complete and submit back to their public SAU for inclusion, again, in that consolidated ESEA application that the public school district submits on behalf of both themselves and any non-public school partners that they have. So this work is really imperative that it takes place in July, and that formal submission to the public school district occurs sometime before August 1st, when that ESEA application becomes due. And lastly, to kind of round out the timeline here, the other kind of major milestone to be aware of each year is October, because this is essentially when year-end reporting comes due for both the public SAU and the non-public school. Again, this is going to be a report out of a number of different things for school districts, but specifically for the non-public school, it's going to be a report out of the programs and activities that have been carried out through Equitable Services. This will include things like reporting out on goals. If you're participating in the Title I program, there'll be some nuanced reporting there that we'll go over a little bit later this morning. But really, this is just kind of a report out to your public school partner of kind of what the outcomes and whatnot related to your equitable service funding has been for the year. As part of this, we also have a carryover reconciliation form that needs to be completed. And basically what this is just a kind of synopsis of what funds have been expended for equitable services in that initial 15-month period of availability, and kind of determine what, if any, funds would remain unspent at the end of that period. And I believe we'll talk a little bit more about specifically that carryover piece here in just a bit. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that October will be a notable time for reporting, and there needs to be some time carved out to, particularly for non-public schools, to be able to collect and report out that data to your public school counterparts.
Great. So here are some examples of what Travis was just talking about. So the non-public consultation or participation form, this is the very top of it. You'll note that where that big red arrow is, this training is mandatory. So all the folks here who are non-public folks, you can check that box. You have watched this training. The video will be hyperlinked for those who were unable to attend today. And this is just the normal form that is right within the application. It's also on our website that ESEA coordinators will be pulling and asking non-publics to fill out on an annual basis to show that they're participating. The other pieces of the form that I just wanted to draw your attention to, where we often see common errors, are you should select yes if you're participating, or sorry, it's a little small on my screen. And if you disagree with services, you'll want to select no, or NA if there are no issues there. So on the bottom part as well, we sometimes see like typed in signatures. That's not approvable. We need to see a written signature on this form as well as the date. All right. This is just a brief reminder for those 3 districts who work with Title I Part D funds. We have a separate consultation form for those NFI North satellite facilities. Just be sure to fill that out also on the website. The allowability, again, just a reminder, is different for Title I Part D. Carryover. So Travis mentioned the carryover form in October that needs to be completed. As he mentioned, ESEA funds are earmarked for equitable services, and they're available for those first 15 months, that first initial period. So after that 15-month period from substantial approval till 9/30, we want to know exactly how much has been expended. And the carryover funds are only available for very specific situations that we'll go over in the next slide. But again, carryover for non-publics is very rare and only happens under very specific circumstances. So you'll really need a strong justification if you want carryover as a non-public. Great. So again, just wanted to show the carryover form itself and highlight some of the areas where we sometimes see errors. So you mark in those boxes where that red line is how much money you have left over. Then what the non-public will do is you need to select option 1, 2, or 3 where that red arrow is pointing. If you do not want the carryover, you'll want to be sure to select that option. If you want to return the funds to the public school, there's an option for that. And again, if you do want the carryover, then you'll need to mark option 1, and then you can see those boxes below where you'll need to write a lengthy description. Sometimes folks will even add another page to add the full details we need to be able to approve carryover for the non-public. So again, the carryover to be approved, this is all from the US Ed non-regulatory guidance. There's 2 circumstances for when we would approve carryover. One is for delayed services due to extenuating circumstances. The other reason we would approve carryover is if the cost of equitable services were under budget and there was insufficient time to provide additional services. So if you, again, something went under budget, you should be working together, the ESEA coordinator and non-public, to come up with a secondary plan and adjusting and trying to spend down those funds. In either case, again, it's got to be above and beyond what the need has to be beyond what you'll be able to address with the current year of funds coming up. So, right, you're reassessing after that 15-month period. And if you have enough money in the new year's funds that you're receiving for equitable services, you'll want to use those first. If you need additional funds to support that need, then you'll want to write a very lengthy carryover description of why your need is above and beyond the funds you'll already be receiving. And again, we gave some blanket exceptions for the pandemic and for Title II. You may have seen a recent memorandum of agreement between the Maine Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Education, where there are some adjustments made for Title II over the next 5 fiscal years. So to help offset that negative impact of those adjustments, we'll be reallocating older state level Title IIA funds. And when this occurs, we're going to grant a blanket carryover for all Title II equitable services so that the non-public schools aren't negatively impacted as well. So there's a few exceptions there, but in general, just be mindful of these stringent requirements for carryover. Unresponsive partner. So again, you want to be consulting, you want to be talking frequently, and ideally very responsive to your collaboration between the non-public school and ESEA coordinator. However, if there's a lot of elements that we've outlined here, different forms that need to be completed, different pieces that are important for completing on time. If a partner becomes unresponsive, then formal communication must be attempted with at least 3 different times with 3 different methods. So the pieces of documentation we recommend are an email, a phone call, and then a certified letter, excuse me, saying, we emailed on this date, we called on this date, we were unable to reach you, and then giving a 2-week deadline to respond to your request. Again, make sure to keep copies of everything. We monitor, the feds monitor, get audited. So keep logs of that communication and definitely want to make sure that you are logging that in case you need record of that non-compliance for these statutory requirements. And if there's any issues, you can work with the state ombudsman as well.
And that's a great segue to the state ombudsman. So the role of the state ombudsman was established in statute to help ensure that equitable services and other benefits for approved, nonprofit, eligible, non-public schools and staff were provided. The responsibilities of the ombudsman is to oversee ESEA equitable service requirements, serve as a general resource regarding equitable services, provide technical assistance as this webinar, and any additional professional assistance as needed. The ombudsman also will engage with non-public schools and SAU officials if an issue were to arise. As has been mentioned in the chat box as well as in our presentation, equitable service consultation is critical, but it's also critical that this type of consultation happens throughout the year, but also before any decisions are made. If there is a concern with services or a lack of services provided, the public SAU must provide a written justification for the decision to the non-public school in which the decision was made and on behalf of. So the non-public school also has the right to file a complaint if there is any disagreement about program planning, services, or lack of consultation. Jeff noted an area on the participation form where the information is available, but also where this information is collected through a yes/no, non-applicable manner. Now we're going to jump into title-specific items associated with equitable services.
Great. Yes. Hello, everyone. Title I, Part A with Equitable Services has two distinct parts that are worth noting. There's the low-income student data collection that was referenced previously. Those are those low-income student counts of Title I students that are submitted into our data systems. Those are not necessarily the same students. That list that you'll submit is not the same list of students receiving services. It's important to note here that to generate the proportional share, that student will be low income and they would have attended a Title I school in their resident district, right? So if they were going to the elementary school that was in their attendance area and that's a Title I school, they would be generating a proportional share if they're also low income. The service eligibility, though, for those non-publics to run the Title I Part A Equitable Services is still true that the student would need to have attended a Title I school. So think equitable services, right? That sort of that if they had been at that other school, they would be a Title I student or potentially a Title I student. So that would make them eligible for services at your non-public. Also, however, and probably the most important, is that they would be identified as a Title I student through that objective criteria, and that is the language in statute. And it can be assessments or other screeners, but essentially Title I students must be those that would have been your highest need students. So that objective criteria is seeing either lower skills or at risk of failing, and they need to be monitored and ensured continued eligibility for services. They always may test out, and you may have students in your non-public that are eligible for that objective criteria as Title I. So it's very, very important to know that your proportional share students and that student data of low income may not be the same as the students who receive services. The key factor here is they would have attended a Title I school for both. And it's worth noting that non-public school is running a targeted assistance program. Some public SAUs have schools that run school-wide. For non-publics, it's targeted. And it must only serve Title I identified students, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And they must have otherwise reside where a Title I school in that same attendance area. You must have a process for identifying Title I students, and it has to be that objective criteria. And you should be tracking that progress because that can fluctuate the students that are receiving the services. You want to be adjusting program according to this progress and staying relevant to the student needs in your non-public school. Absolutely must be notifying families of services. and you must be implementing this program with Title I certified staff. So we're looking for state certified staff here to be able to help run these programs. You can use your funds, your Title I funds, on academic supplies to improve these high need areas for Title I students. You can and will be required to, especially if you are a non-public that has an SAU who has a family engagement set-aside reservation. So for those public SAUs that receive over $500,000 in Title I, you set aside at least 1%. And in the ESEA consolidated application every year, you will be consulting with your non-public about the family engagement practices that they're facilitating. So that, again, equitable services. And then professional development for Title I staff. So although professional development is often considered Title II, Title I funds can pay for the professional development for the Title I staff that is working with these students. So that's important to note in case you want that teacher to be, let's say, newly understanding or have learned the science of reading, and you want to send that Title I staff to work on that. That is allowable under Title I funding. And not allowable is providing services, sort of the opposite of what I just said, to non-identified students who do not reside in a Title I school, using non-Title I certified staff to support those students, and then paying for those supplies and activities or professional development that doesn't have to do with their Title I program. So it's a narrow focus here, and rightfully so for those students and their high needs.
All right, as Rita just hinted at, Title II is often seen as money for professional development. Officially, the intent and purpose of Title II is to increase student achievement by increasing teacher and principal quality. So what are some sort of allowable use of funds for equitable services? As always, supplemental programs and services that provide professional development for teachers, principals, and other building-based school leaders that are sustained, intensive, collaborative, job-embedded, data-driven, and classroom-focused. While it is a mouthful, that is the definition we have for professional development in statute. And really the idea is to avoid kind of the one and done short-term conferences and workshops and make sure that any PD we're providing is part of a more holistic long-term plan. I would also just draw attention to the folks who can benefit from these funds. For Title II, it's teachers, principals, and other building-based school leaders. Unfortunately, our colleagues who are ed techs are not eligible to benefit from Title II funds. In the course of receiving that professional development, there might be travel expenses, stipends if this work is done outside of a teacher's contracted day, supplies and materials related to the PD. All of these can be an allowable use of funds. But again, all these funds have to be maintained by the public SAU. So if you're paying staff a stipend for work done outside of their contracted day, that stipend agreement is between the public SAU and the staff. If you are reimbursing for a college course, that reimbursement is done between the public SAU and the non-public staff person taking the course, following whatever procedures and processes the public SAU has in place. Some unallowable use of funds for equitable services. These first two are allowable for our friends who are working in public SAUs, but because they are meeting the needs of the school and not the students, are not allowed in equitable services. So that includes things like staffing costs. So paying for substitute teachers or class size reduction is not allowed with equitable services. And then recruitment and retention activities are also not allowed with equitable services. One kind of common misnomer we continue to see that we want to correct is that Title II should not be used for curriculum writing and the purchase of any curricular materials to be used in the classroom. You can do professional development about how to write curriculum and how to implement curriculum, but you can't actually create the curriculum and you cannot purchase the curricular materials with Title IIA funds. And like I said, the PD needs to be tied to the needs of the students in the school, not based on ideological concepts.
Title III has 3 categories under which the funds must be spent. Improvement of language instruction, professional development, and family community engagement. Those are the 3 categories. Again, Restating what my colleagues have said, again, the public SAU maintains the fiscal ownership of all of these funds, so everything needs to be navigated and contracted through the public school. The first category for Title III is improvement of language instruction, which can support activities such as enhancing the existing program, hiring additional supplemental ESOL staff, and adapting targeted programs for students experiencing limited or interrupted formal education. It can also support multilingual learners with disabilities or refugee students. The second category that Title III funds can be used for is providing professional development for a staff member at the non-public school that has been contracted with the public school and works with identified multilingual students. Again, restating the fact that my colleagues have indicated that this has to be identified student needs versus the betterment of the school itself at the non-public level. This could be best practice workshops, coaching, or working with educational consultants. The third category in Title III supports family and community engagement. Here, funds can be used on activities such as creating partnerships with community organizations to help improve student outcomes or to support families. Holding events to seek community input on general education of multilingual students, and more specifically, the impact of language acquisition programming. Funds can also be levered to help train families to become more active participants in the education of their children. Following the theme of the team, we're going to kind of highlight a few of the unallowable uses of funds for Title III. Non-public schools must have an established program for multilingual students before equitable services under Title III can be processed. This information appears on the Equitable Services Spending Snapshot, again, being sure that the identification of these students is part of the consultation meeting between the public school and the non-public school is critical.
Okay. So next up is Title IV, otherwise known as the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program. This is a multi-purpose block grant that basically allows schools and communities to invest in various aspects of their educational system. Similar to Title III, Title IV is divvied up into a few different content areas or subcategories, if you will, under which funds can be used. Now, regardless of what content area we're talking about, Title IV-A funds generally support either direct programs and services for students or professional learning opportunities for teachers and other school staff who are working directly with students. So that having been said, the first of the kind of content areas for Title IV Part A is the well-rounded education content area, which really refers to programs and activities that are academically focused, but go beyond core academic instruction in math, literacy, and science. So these are programs and activities that can focus on things like history and civics, music and the arts, STEM, or really other types of interdisciplinary content that would, again, go above and beyond core academic instruction. So subsequently, Title IV funds can also support programs and activities that focus more on the physical and mental health of students. So here we have the Safe and Healthy Students content area. Again, can support direct services for students or professional development for staff that are working directly with students. And as you can see here, there's quite the gamut of things that funds can be used to support, ranging from things like school counseling and mentoring, all the way over to physical health and nutrition education. Lastly, we have the third and final content area here for Title IV-A, which focuses on technology integration in schools. So the quote, effective use of technology content area really is meant to support programs and activities that serve to enhance the use of technology to better support instruction and instructional practices for students. This can range again in a number of different areas, but typically lands in the realm of things like digital or personalized learning, remote instructional practices or hybrid instruction models, things of that nature. I do just want to emphasize here that when we talk about the effective use of technology, the phrase use of technology is really important here, in that this is really more focused on the training, planning, and implementing, as opposed to the outright purchase of devices, software, etc. Now, similar to what others have shared, there are some Title IV specific things that funds cannot be used for. Now, when it comes to things that are expressly prohibited in statute, it really boils down to Title IV for predominantly things related to student health and safety. So there are things around, various types of medical services that can't be provided. There are some nuances, if you're going to do any sort of reproductive health education, things like that to be aware of. And really, again, just to reiterate the point around well-rounded education, that Title IV-A funds cannot support core academic instruction in math, literacy, and science. It has to go above and beyond, or if it's going to include those content areas, the work has to be interdisciplinary in nature. Now, a couple of kind of ancillary considerations specific to the Title IV program. The program is a bit unique as compared to the other ESEA programs when it comes to how funds are actually spent, because the Title IV Part A program has specific content area spending or funding requirements associated with it. So if a public SAU and or non-public school are planning to expend or leverage funds rather under the well-rounded education or student health and safety content areas, the funding leverage needs to total at least 20% of the overall Title IV Part A allocation that's gone out to the public school and non-public school partnership. Funds under the effective use of technology can be any amount greater than zero. And there are some nuances here too, dependent on how much overall funding that the public SAU gets. The one thing to note with the effective use of technology piece, I mentioned this a bit in the previous couple of slides, but the intent there is really on the training, planning, et cetera, around the use of technology, and less so on the purchase of devices and software. Now, that's not to say that those are expressly prohibited expenses, but you are notably limited in how much funding you can leverage for those purposes. So there's a special rule in statute that essentially dictates no more than 15% of the funds budgeted for under that effective use of technology project category can be spent for what's known as technology infrastructure. So that, again, gets back to those devices and software licenses, et cetera. So I share that bit of information because it can have implications on equitable services and kind of the planned programs and activities between public SAUs and their non-public school partners, because there may be instances where the amount of equitable service funding that a non-public school would be eligible for would be less than 20% of the overall allocation that goes to the SAU, which means that there could be some challenge in both parties being able to leverage the funds exactly the way they want to. I give an example here of kind of a 90-10 split in enrollment where the public SAU wishes to spend funds in one way and the non-public school wishes to spend funds in a different way. Given this example on screen right now, the non-public school would not be able to leverage funds for well-rounded education purposes because the amount there would be less than that 20% minimum requirement. So there would need to be some level of work between the two parties so that that amount could come up to the 20% minimum that would be needed there.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to go over some fiscal oversight. As with all federal funds, all expenses that are reimbursed by federal funds must be reasonable, necessary, applicable, allowable. They must be well documented and neutral in nature. On the documentation, I just want to spend a few minutes here. Please make sure that you provide the public SAU with all documents so that they can seek reimbursement for any services or goods that have been provided for your equitable services. The substantial approval date oftentimes delays the non-public from being able to acquire equitable services or goods because it's not always a full 15 months. The public SAU oftentimes gets substantial approval later on. So please don't leave that consultation where you've agreed to equitable services and goods and go out and try to contract with somebody right away. You don't have the allowability for those services quite yet. Some unallowable uses. This is with all ESEA funded. Obviously, there's no direct payments to the non-public school from the public SAU at any time for equitable services. It can be used to pay administrative and central office staff, construction, renovation, or remodeling, textbooks, general education materials for the school, advertising, public relations, and fundraising. These are certain expenses that aren't allowed, and we're going to review more on the next slide. I want to use an example for you. If the non-public orders supplies and then sends the invoice to the public SAU, which in turn must pay the vendor directly for those supplies in pay the vendor for the items ordered. This is allowable. However, it's truly not best practice. For some reason, the non-public decides they don't want those books and they return them, then the public SAU that has been reimbursed for those supplies needs to now return funds to the SEA. Some other unallowable uses are for awards, award ceremonies, gift cards, and certificates, food, unless instructional supplies for students. So if you're going to, I don't know, bake something and it's going to be related to math instruction or literacy, you can get the ingredients for that project, but you can't just buy food for conferences or parent-teacher night. Obviously, no alcoholic beverages, non-educational trips, games, or other costs. Any costs that are non-secular or ideological in nature. Field trips can be educational, but one must prove that trip to a hockey game can be linked to the application for funds. This is the public SAU's application, and it would be written in detail under the non-public project. and it must meet a high needs area for the students. In addition to all costs associated with the trip must be reasonable and necessary to meet the goals outlined in the application for funds. Services must be supplemental. We've gone over that. The public SAU controls the actual funds under Title 34 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It provides guidance for use of private school personnel. A grantee or subgrantee may use program funds to pay for the services of an employee of a private school if the employee performs the services outside of his or her regular hours of duty, and that's not or, it's and, must meet these two stipulations. The employee performs the services under public supervision and control. The public SAU must use funds under covered programs to meet the identified educational needs of eligible private school students and not the needs of the non-public school or the general needs of students in the non-public. The public SAU must also ensure that equitable services it provides under the programs. Any materials purchased remain the property of the public SAU. The book example that I just gave is a perfect example of this. Those books that were purchased are the property of the public SAU. It is best practice that if the non-public decides they don't want to use those books or the books weren't what they wanted, return them to the public SAU. And then it's their responsibility to get the credit for that return of material.
Great. We're going to move on to the reporting and monitoring because nothing in federal funding and education doesn't require reporting and monitoring. So a big one with Title I Part A is the way that we as a state know who in the non-publics is receiving these services, who are these students, these Title I students you have in your non-public, is through this performance report page, the supplemental data page. So public SAUs are probably very familiar. They may ask you for your student demographic data, the grade level data, and the instructional services data of those students. Are they in math? Are they in reading? What grades are they in? And that's always for that previous school year. And then, of course, non-publics are actually not exempt from monitoring because you are receiving funding, or not receiving funding, but you're being able to have equitable services with your SAU that receives the funding. The SAU is monitored, and there will be a few items that touch sort of the process with the non-public. That is the consultation meeting minutes. Very important that that's documented processes, that you're speaking to your students' high needs and you're coming up with a plan for those funds. There's stakeholder groups, including the non-publics and the students in those non-publics. That is a requirement. There's the procurement process or the written procedures that you have for payments that are being made on behalf of and not to the non-public. So we look for documentation concerning that. And then for items C2 and C3, it's similar to B1, where it's stakeholder that you're gathering feedback when it comes to your high needs processes, but this is related to professional development specifically, and that it's meeting the statutory definition of professional development. And we'll share the monitoring webpage as well, because these fact sheets do include some of that information. So that public SAU, when they're being monitored, will work with the non-public to ensure that the documentation is submitted.
And as I put in the chat box, we have a lot of content and we knew we were going to have a lot of material to share with you folks today. So if you fear that you have a question that might not be tended to in the time that you have with us today, be sure you put it in the chat box and we will follow up with you individually and create a question and answer guidance, as we know our time is coming to an end very quickly. We, at the top of the hour, mentioned this consultation timeline as well as the way in which Equitable Services operates throughout the entire fiscal year. We are at a point in March of 2025 where we are preparing Equitable Services information for FY26 ESEA consolidated application. So the link for this survey is completed every year. You, as a non-public school, likely completed it last year if you participated in Equitable Services for FY25. There is questions associated with the certified data that is collected as the Department of Education, but also an opportunity for our non-public to provide more accurate information. We are encouraging our non-public schools to complete this quick survey as soon as possible, but within the next couple of weeks is greatly appreciated. Ryan has popped the link right in the chat box. We are also made the link available in our newsletter, and will also be available when we publicize the slideshow associated with today's webinar. We will also provide you with a number of resources. So we have some resources on our website, but we are also going to put them in the chat box here momentarily so that you folks have all the links in one area. Again, our website has been redesigned, but all of the documentation that we shared with you today in our PowerPoint and our training is available on our website. Just a few things in regards to if you do have additional questions after today's time together. Our public schools should be reaching out to our regional program managers. Our non-public schools, their first point of contact is your public SAU. So really engaging in that partnership between the SAU and the non-public school is critical for all of the work associated with Equitable Services. Again, it's our due diligence to be sure that you have the ability to reach out to all components of the work that we do as a Department of Education. So here are all of our social